Hi, my name is Josh Sperry, and this is my moment to talk about my class, the class that I took on Advanced Ministerial Internship. This was some great information, and I'm excited to just take a few minutes to share what I've learned and then some of the things that I learned from ordained ministers in our network. When we look at this idea, there's this word called biblical literacy. And in this class, we saw that most Christians only open up their Bibles and read it once to twice a week. This means we have a daunting task, and what we know and understand from Scripture is so important, and I hope that this number is so much higher for us that we call ourselves leaders. I broke this class down in a few areas that stood out to me, and the first one is just the practice of doing ministry. I loved what one of the theologians in this class talked about, and he said this: God is not in control, but He is in charge, which means we are responsible often for the things that happen. We need to take a responsibility for what we're doing in ministry. God's not in control, but He is in charge. So we lean on Him, but we're in control of the scenario, and we need to handle it well. This also talked about, which I think is so important for us as ministers, the difference between condemnation and judging. Condemnation is not from the Lord, which is looking down on them, but judging, from what Scripture was saying, is important. And this is helping each other, really actually taking the time to help each other with critical things that might be uncomfortable to talk about. There was a lot in this class about this idea of the gospel of accommodation, which would be a watered down, simple gospel. The language used in this class here was very strong. I did not agree with all of it, but I believe that many of this can be a watered down gospel that is a concern. He said some of this is spurred from hell itself. I've been a part of churches that lean into gospel heavy ministry, and I would disagree with that, but it was talked about in this class. A commonly critiqued characteristic of poor preaching today is that there's a greater love for preaching than there is for people. People matter. No matter what our gift set is, we have to see people first. I love this idea, especially when it comes to preaching to young people. I preach for and not at, using the language of we. What are we experiencing together? I'm not preaching at people, I'm preaching for people. Second idea I wrote down is leading yourself. Really, if we want to hear God's voice, the pace of life matters for us. We need to walk slow, and we need to have the margin to be able to hear God's voice. I love that there was time taken in this class for the importance of long-term therapy to hear from the voice of God, and that the church needs to get over being against antidepressants and other drugs that help us in ministry. A couple years ago, I hit burnout, and what it came to, I found a counselor, and what I learned was I just did not have good, healthy rhythms in my life to know how to deal with anxiety. I didn't even know that I had it. But through counseling and some medication, I'm healthier now than I've ever been. And this came from me learning how to lead myself better. Healthy leaders, the truth is, they abide with God. And that takes time and that takes energy. It's not the last thing. It really should be the only thing, and we overflow from that. Food and exercise affect the way that we study and the way that we treat people. I've found this so true for me. If I'm going to be preaching on a Sunday, I need to have lots of food and water in the morning, and then not too much all the way through. There was some great stuff talked about in this class about cell phones, and if I'm honest, this was convicting for me. It talked about how addicted we are to our phones, that if we're sitting at tables, we have to have them. We have to look at them before we even say hi to our spouse. And through this, it's killed the idea of creativity. We're looking for these instant gratification moments all the time. And because of that, we don't know how to dig deep. Our mind doesn't ever have time to wander. And it's hard for us to lead ourselves well when this is the case. On the other side of this, when it comes to addictions, this is what was said. About 57% of pastors would say that they have struggled with pornography. 64% of youth pastors. And you see this higher, 5% leads, 12% of youth pastors that would say they are currently addicted. And I believe so many of these addictions come back to unhealthy rhythms of knowing how to lead ourselves well. The last thing I wrote down here was being on mission personally. Courageous leaders, they serve the leader. They know how to follow the leader. And I believe the best leaders see those that don't know Christ yet and also disciple those that are apart. There's a huge dropout in our churches. 6 out of 10 during their 20s drop out of church. And that should just be unacceptable. So we have to change the way that we do some things. They might attend church, but don't stay because we are not discipling. If we just stay, go get more people, but our own faith is not being grown, there's an issue there. 1 in 6 are married by the age of 25. That number is getting higher and higher, so we have to speak a different language. And we need to engage non-Christians with respect. We can't just start with the idea that they're wrong. We need to listen to hear and understand, and not just to respond. And we need to take them seriously. This is my brother. My brother walked away from the church. He would say that he's still a person of faith. But I wrote this down, that we must accept skeptics before we argue with them. They are people. And my brother needs to be accepted by me if I even want to consider the idea of him coming back to church. And I'm grateful we have that relationship. Meeting with mentors, I had so many great insights. Most of my questions were around rhythms, and I'm grateful for what they had to say. I wrote this down at the end. We are Christians first and pastors second. What we do as pastors matter, but it comes from the overflow of what God's doing in us as Christ followers. I love this class. Thank you so much for it.